Welcome to a special edition of Deep Look. It is sometime between Christmas and New Year's. I don't know exactly when this episode will air. We are recording it in advance before the holidays. We're going to take a little time off. So if there's been news, we're probably not talking about it on this show. But I'm Charlie Eisenhood, joined by Keith Rayner. And today we're going to be talking about officiating in Ultimate and a little bit about rules. They go hand in hand. But we've got a great group of panelists to talk about this with, Keith. A key observer and rules person from USAU, a key game advisor person from WFDF, and a key referee from the AUDL. It should be a really enlightening conversation.
Yeah, we probably have 75% of the knowledge about the rules in the world of a flying disc going to be in this conversation. There's a lot to talk about too. I mean, this is obviously it's been a long talked about topic, how to officiate Ultimate, but given that there are so many different modalities now, you can actually compare and contrast them and have people discuss about the differences and the advantages in a way that I don't think really existed before. There really was just one or two ways of doing it. And now we've actually seen a couple different methodologies develop.
Yeah. And this has been a hot topic for decades. I mean, you go back to old UPA magazines from the 1990s, and there's articles about we need observers. Obviously we have observers now in USAU, but now we have the conversation about referees versus observers. And that was such an explosive topic 6 to 8 years ago. It feels like the fire has died down a little bit on that front, but now we have, the WFDF system with minimal oversight, really, from the officials who can't make binding calls. They provide their perspective, but they can't make binding calls. Observers, of course, can make binding calls if they're asked by the players to do that in certain situations. And then you have referees, which is the sort of the other end of the spectrum. So we're going to hear from basically the kind of the architects of each of those systems or rules anyway, and ton of experience. All of these folks, Janna Hamaker, Rueben Berg, Josh Cooper, have been doing this for a long time, care deeply about the rules and about officiating. And it gets a little spicy at times, but that's what we'd expect. And I think there's more to be learned from the other systems and how to kind of improve on each of them, regardless of where you fall in what you prefer. So more to come next with our officiating roundtable panel. Don't go anywhere. Today we have a very special holiday roundtable edition of Deep Look, where we're going to be talking about officiating in Ultimate. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Joining us, Janna Hamaker is the USA Ultimate National Rules Director. She also sits on the Observer Working Group and serves as a game advisor for the World Flying Disc Federation, and has just been a key observer for a long time at this point. Hi, Janna.
Hi.
And then we have Rueben Berg, the chair of the WFDF Ultimate Rules Subcommittee. Maybe you've seen him on YouTube explaining the rules in WFDF. He's also a head game advisor and always at the big WFDF events. Rueben, thank you for getting up super early in the morning to record with us. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing not too bad. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about the rules and officiating.
And last but not least, Josh Cooper is the director of officials for the AUDL. He's been an official in the league since 2013, second year of the league, and has been observing since all the way back to the year 2000. Josh, welcome.
Thanks.
All right. So I've been dreaming about this for a long time, to sit down and talk about officiating in Ultimate. And, when we first started Ultiworld in 2012, 2013, I mean, refs versus observers was one of the big topics. And it's interesting because as, now 10 years later, it feels like that is a less pressing conversation than it's been in the past. And at least it's not quite as explosive, a controversial a topic, but still a topic nonetheless. So that will certainly be an undercurrent of today's conversation. But I kind of wanted to get a sense from each of you, maybe first and foremost, in your areas of expertise on, where do things stand right now with the officiating in the sport? I think we've seen a lot of changes to the observer program. The game advisor program isn't even that old. It's kind of been developing over the last few years. And then AUDL refereeing and the rules there is relatively new as well. I mean, since 2012. So, and we've seen alterations there. So how would you assess where things stand right now? Janna, we'll start with you.
Honestly, I think things are always going to be changing a little bit. The observer program, I think probably when AUDL started thinking, hey, we need to be a little bit more stringent, and have backed off that to be, making sure that we keep the game in the players' hands, and we only rule when asked, and less sort of injecting, except with the case where we have been injecting more is behavioral sanctions. And so, but I think that's been asked for. And so while we're not injecting and saying, hey, y'all are always fast counting unless it's, egregious, we do initiate behavior sanctions more so than we used to. We've tried to standardize that.
Josh, how would you describe what's going on in the AUDL refereeing world right now?
I'd say we're making progress every year. There's no doubt that we started with a blank slate in a sense of having referees in Ultimate. And I think that we've really come a long way since the first few seasons. And I think that there's definitely a long way to go. And I feel like we're genuinely making progress each year towards being better.
And the GA program, it's been an evolving one. It's very interesting. It's been fun to go to these events because we had a couple of years off there, Rueben. So what's going on in the WIFDIF land?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, where we're at with the Game Advisor program and the WFDF events overall, I think is in a really strong position. I think we've just come off of World Games, which I think easily regarded as some of the best Ultimate that's ever happened in the world. That was a phenomenal event, and I think the play was fantastic, but I think the self-officiating was fantastic. And I kind of gauge some of these things on how many posts I see on Reddit about bad calls or bad things that have happened. And there was not a lot of issues around World Games. And even if you go to World Clubs, there was not a lot of issues. And it's tricky kind of what do you compare it to? And if you compare it to, we don't like to talk about it that much, but if you compare it to 2012 Canada, Japan, we're in a really good space in terms of that. And I think that I also gauge it based on how much I get pushed from the North American teams to say you should be going to observers, and how much I get pushed from European teams saying we should get rid of everything. I feel like we're in a pretty good place where we're at. It's still developing. I think we still need to kind of continue to make sure we've got a really strong system in place, but I think it's in a good position from my perspective.
That's definitely one of the challenges. I actually have never been an official with Ultimate, but I did referee basketball. And like, if you're doing it right, nobody says anything, and if you're doing it wrong, everybody says everything. So it can be challenging, right, to field that feedback, like you mentioned, Rueben. But I also want to ask and kind of pull back the curtain a little bit, because I think that a lot of people probably don't know much about, I'm going to say organizations, but each of your organizations, so to speak, within these groups and how big they are, or how many people are coming in and out. So I actually would like to pull back the curtain a little bit and ask about, how many different people are working within your group, and how is retention and the health of those groups, and we can start and go in reverse order from where we just were. So we can start with Rueben and find out how expansive are, and what's the scope really of the group of people that you're working with.
Yeah, for sure. So at the kind of the top level of WFDF, we've got the Ultimate Committee, which kind of makes the big overarching decisions around Ultimate and how it's officiated and what the Game Advisor program kind of involves. And that's a group of 6 of us, I think. It's been a fairly stable group across the years now. And then we've got a game advisor working group, which there's about 5 of us on that, including Janna's on that as well. And we kind of look at the game advisor program in particular. And then in terms of our pool of game advisors across the globe, there is a suite of game advisors we have that have got the skills and the training from across the globe. The numbers that we have kind of expressing interest in different events, that every time we have them, we have like at least 100 people express interest in the events, and we then have to try and select the right game advisors for the right places. So I think it would be good to expand it, but we're also really mindful that every time we make a new game advisor, that's a new person who has to represent what it's all about. And if we have people doing it the wrong way, then that tarnishes what we're trying to do as well. So we're mindful of not just saying, everyone, you can be a game advisor, you can be a game advisor, because that doesn't benefit us, but we need to ensure there's capacity for growth as well.
Josh, we'll go to you next.
Sure. So what exactly do you want to know?
So I'm curious as to how many refs are there currently in the AUDL, and how do you feel like you are positioned to either, do you feel like you need to grow? Do you feel like you've had a good retention rate? Those types of things.
We have around 200 referees in the AUDL referee pool, and it varies depending on the location. There are locations where we certainly need to recruit more, and there are places where we are focused mainly on just training and improvement, and we don't need additional people. We have some places where we are okay as long as retention remains high. Retention has been pretty high. And yeah, that's it. We still need to recruit always. I think we always will. We want to make sure that we take care of our refs and retain them. And for those that are sticking with us, we are always focusing on not just the onboarding training, but constant improvement.
I will say something about reffing is it works really well schedule-wise for the folks who ref. The time commitment for GAing, you usually have a week. And for USAU, it's anywhere, 3 or 4 days. And so the time commitment certainly works better for if you have things to do outside of officiating. It works good with your schedule.
Sorry, go ahead, Charles.
So I was just going to say, Janna, we hear so much, from players. We want more observers. We need more. Like, why isn't there an observer on my game? And why isn't there an observer clinic by me? And it feels like there's a real effort from the observer group and USA Ultimate to try to recruit more observers, but it feels like that's been a difficult process, and you do have to rely a lot on a smallish pool of people. I mean, I see the same observers at most of the big major events. So, in some ways, it feels like there's a higher demand for observers than maybe any of these programs because of the scope of how many competitions want them these days. How is that going?
So I think we did run into some, a lot of, right when COVID happened, we also had a new rule set. And so people had to recertify on their new rule set. And I think not everybody was certified at that time. And so, but there are a lot more new faces recently than there have been. And so I think the new folks who are coming in are sticking with it. And I'm seeing them over and over. So the people who joined like either right before COVID or have started coming to more nationals events during COVID or like right at the tail end in 2021. They're sticking with it. But in general, with observers, a lot of our pool also coaches. And so we run into, volunteer scarcity. A lot of folks, they're either retired, and so they retire and they coach, or they're retiring and they're having young kids. And so it's just not, I don't know. I mean, I enjoy it. Obviously, I've been doing it for a very long time, but I don't think people see it as rewarding, perhaps, as some of the other ways to give time, which is sad. But it's fun. So we clearly are not doing, we're not finding the right hook. We need to continue to figure out ways to do that better. It's not that we're not trying, because we are, but we need to figure out what's going to make it really hit.
Is it money?
I'm in a weird situation because I personally don't take money, but I do, because I get my flights paid for and things. So I guess I do take money. But yeah, I think it could be money. But it's already a big budget item, officials. And I don't know if the stomach is there for more. I think it needs to be. I used to run Potlatch before it was Sunbreak. And, bid fees were high because our fields were high. But people did it because they paid it because, the product was good. And even though it was a lot more expensive than other tournaments, I don't know. I guess we could, increase. It's going to come out of the players' pockets, right? Unless we have sponsorships, it's going to come out of the players' pockets. And so I don't know where the tipping point is there. But it certainly, I think, would help in recruitment.
Yeah, I think John is on something that your typical person, if you're looking to get former players to be your officials, that you're going to lose a lot of them because it's not their top way of giving back or retiring. They'd rather play, they'd rather coach, they'd rather do something else. And certainly people are incentivized by standard incentives, which includes money. And that if you're looking for people who really have volunteered to observe in 2000, you're looking at a very small group of people who seem to genuinely enjoy it. So I think it's a challenge to get people to want to do this with their time. If you're looking particularly at the ultimate pool.
Well, I just want to ask, what's the going rate right now? Josh, in the AUDL, what do you get paid for a game as an official?
Well, this last season, I'll say it depended on your role. It was either $75, $100, or $125 for the game, with additional bonuses for travel if that was required. We always tried to staff people locally. And if you did travel, there was a travel bonus as well as everything being covered. But ideally, you're able to just drive right there, probably make $100 average, and then, enjoy your evening.
Yeah. I mean, and let it be said, observers are not making $100 a game.
Yeah.
At the big national tournaments, are observers even getting paid? Last I heard, they were not.
So we don't get money for the games. We get travel, lodging, and meals covered.
Right. Is that the same for GAs, Rueben?
Yeah, that's the same. So you get flights, you get accommodation and meals, and then some people, depending, because we try and have a certain number of people who are local to kind of keep costs down, and some people choose to be considered a local by paying for their own flights to come there. So not everybody's flights are covered who turns up to an event, but at least generally about half.
And
we do have some.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Janna.
Okay, I was going to say, different organizations do pay their observers. So I know Dis Northwest pays. It's certainly not $100 a game. It's usually around $100 a day. And I know other organizations, I think Triangle does. A lot of other organizations pay observers.
We also have some travel events. And when we have our travel events, we do the same thing that USAU does, and I believe that WIFDF does, is cover everything associated with the event. But we do have far fewer of those because of our structure.
Now, given these constraints that you're speaking to, obviously it takes it's a specific type of person who's in a given space in their lives for this and have an interest in doing it. And my sense is just externally from just being around the game is that there is a pretty decent amount of crossover between people who are reffing, who are game advisors, who are observers. Certainly you're hearing that in some of your own personal experiences as well. Do you all have a sense of how much of that group is working within multiple of these groups? And is that good for officiating? Is that healthy, or is it necessary, or is it something that you hope that is not going to be a part of the future of officiating? Janna, we can go with you.
Sure. There is definitely overlap. I've done all three. I think the GA program, since it's fairly new, couldn't help but be seeded by several observers. And so I think that's quite natural. Same for refs. That was the main pool to pull from, was observers, since that's the oldest program. So it's only natural that there's overlap. I think it's healthy. Just as it's healthy for the players to play under different systems so that they can form their own opinions. I think it's healthy for the officials. I know, I became, my ability to see things improved when I reffed. It trains you to, be, mentally faster. And so I noticed that my observing improved, after doing that. And so I think it's actually good, and you learn things. So like I learned a lot by being a GA, bringing it back to observing to this is the player's game, and, it needs to be in their hands. However, when they do come to us, we rule. So, I take things from each program to apply it.
And is that a good thing? Is that a good thing to have? Does it feel like there's any kind of convergence happening across the disciplines of officiating? Obviously, Janna, you have this sort of unique experience of having done all three. There's probably not that many people who have done all three in the world. But are we seeing convergence, or are we seeing stuff staying in their silos? I mean, I think there's arguments both ways, perhaps.
I think there's influence. I don't think there's convergence.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in there from my perspective with that idea. And I have a lot of great respect for the USA U Observer system. I think it's a fantastic system that has developed over years and has a really strong standing and has a really, I think, good processes in place to actually do what it does. I'm not familiar at all really with the referee system, so I can't really comment on that. But from what I've seen of the Observer system, I think it is a really strong system for what it tries to do. But clearly WFDF is trying to do a different thing. And we're trying to keep the game entirely self-officiated, so it's only ever the players making the calls. And I often hear pushback from people saying, well, why don't you add this little role from observers and this little role from observers? I'm like, if we're going to be observers, we would just be observers. Once we cross that line of saying it's not self-officiated, we're not going to come up with some whole other different system. We would just bring in observers. But that's not where WFDF wants to be. We want to be still on that line of players make all the calls. And while we're at that place, we're going to try and learn some of the things we can from what's happening in other systems. But we're only ever going to break that plane, break the glass, and go all the way to be observers, not to do little bits and pieces. So I think that's often an interesting conversation I hear that I think it kind of misses the point that the whole idea of the game advisors is the players are making all the decisions every single time. So that's, I think, it's interesting to kind of see and compare what's happening in other places, but we're not going to break that until someone else tells us we have to, because that's not something I'm pushing for and not something I've heard anyone at the higher levels of WFDF pushing for. We're going to try and do the best system we can within that constraint.
I'm not sure about the words influence versus convergence, but I definitely think that we all share some really important goals. Our strategies and tactics might be different, but we certainly, I think, all want to have safe, fair, fun, and efficient games. We certainly going to have, again, different strategies for that, but I wouldn't call it convergence because I think we're already there. I think we just share those basic goals. So I think that's something that whether it's observing or reffing, and obviously I can't speak to being a GA, those are things that I find consistent amongst both organizations, both groups of people?
I will say, so I'll agree that, we all want safe play, but I think we all have, none of us want people to get, nobody wants dangerous plays to be happening. And people want everybody to, like, if they fouled, to say they fouled, but that's not happening, right? And so each program, they're not the same. They attack these things differently. And we're not in agreement on how that should be handled at all. And I think, the observer program is sort of the middle of the road. Refs, it's on refs, and then they have the integrity rule. And then GA, it's all on the player's hands. So, even if there's a dangerous play, player could be like, I don't think so. And so it's not the same. GAs make this fully self-officiated, which is the line that they've, drawn. And it's the line for the program. And it's not, it's not catered towards North American play. It's catered towards the world. And, it's a good line for the purposes. USAU, we're focused on, as much as possible to be in the player's hands. Safe, try to keep it safe with misconduct penalties and that way, but not go to full ref because we still want it to be self-officiated.
I think of that list that was given, I agree with that list from Josh. I think one of the interesting ones, though, is fairness. And from my experience working with observers and working with game advisors and the WFDF system and the USA system, is that I think fairness is perceived in different ways in those ultimate cultures. I see very much that within the USA ultimate culture, fairness is about every single time getting exactly the correct result. And to me, I see fairness within the WFDF system of coming to that overall spirit of, if it's not quite sure what happened, it's fair for the disc to go back. And I see that as one of the bigger differences and one of the biggest drivers actually between the differences of how things are officiated between our system, where we've got game advisors who it's not our main job to help resolve calls. It's at the, and we can debate this, but it's our official policy. It's the bottom of our list of our priorities of what to do is to help resolve disputes. And that's because our idea of fairness is not that every single time every call is exactly correct. It's that the rules are followed, and the rules say if it's unclear what happened, it's fair to send it back. That's what I see is quite interesting around that. What we mean by fairness is a big distinction, I think, across all three.
Well, Josh, I think it's clear that the game advisor and observer systems and those rule sets are coming from where Ultimate has been, and so it was a pretty big shift to move into a third-party officiation that the game was no longer player controlled, but the referees were making a lot of the calls, and the players were then able to respond to that. What's the feedback that you have gotten from players, from officials, from fans? Do people say, hey, I actually think this is better? Or are there people who are telling you that it's worse? They wish that the players had more control. As the one who's instituted the change, I'm curious to hear what people are saying about it, and what advantages and disadvantages you've discovered in having the officials making a lot more of the calls and having a lot more control of the game.
All right, well, first, just for clarity's sake, I wouldn't say I instituted the change because the league started in 2012 and I became the director of officials in 2013, although I've instituted plenty of changes. And I'm sure that the feedback I get probably has a certain level of selection bias involved. But I'd say, after all, if you really didn't want to even try playing with refs, or if you really didn't like playing with refs, you may have just stopped playing in the AUDL if that was ever an option in the first place. But I will say that the feedback I get is overwhelmingly positive if it's about the question of the existence of refs versus observers, as opposed to feedback about, specific calls. Again, I'm sure that there's a selection, bias going on, but I get a lot of people saying that they like playing with the refs.
I think it's interesting though, because one of the things that always stands out to me, I've been watching Ultimate games for a decade and I've been commentating on them for just about as long as that. Some of the most notable moments in the AUDL are when players overrule the officials, when they overrule the referees and they call the integrity rule into play. When that happens, that can be a very noticeable, big, discussable topic that doesn't quite have the same marketability moments in non-refereed games. Because even though there's very similar results sometimes, maybe somebody makes a call and then they retract it, or they don't make a call where it looks like they could have made a call. There's something that's sort of more noticeable, like, wow, they overruled the referee. And like in the culture of sports in the United States, at least, well, I think coming off the World Cup, we can say it also exists internationally, is you try to, maybe if you get a call that goes in your favor, even if it's not the right call, you take advantage of that. And that's, of course, been a big discussion point around refereed Ultimate on its own. But I think it does. There's this. What's the question I'm getting to? I guess there's an interesting element to the AUDL as it stands today, because players are coming up in a non-refereed system where having fair calls be a part of the way that you play the game directly ends up translating into these integrity rule moments. And like, will that be lost? That's obviously a big topic of conversation in Ultimate, and it has been in the past around this refs observers discussion. So what's the question that I have here? I'm sort of just talking about it in general. Is there a concern, and I can leave this to the group, maybe Josh can answer first. Is there a concern that we lose that we lose these integrity rule moments because the incentive structure changes when you don't actually have to make fair calls in order for the game to function?
Yeah, so this is certainly something I'm sure we've all thought about. I guess one question would really be an empirical one. I don't have any data on this. Is there a different prevalence of integrity calls from players who never played in a competitive other sport versus those who, obviously, if you grew up playing Ultimate, you never had refs. But if you played high school soccer or basketball, you did have refs. And so you actually grew up with both systems. And we certainly have athletes in the AUDL who really didn't grow up playing Ultimate at all. And I don't know if there is a different prevalence of integrity calls based on that. I'll also say, though, that the question is sort of predicated on the assumption that there would be refs in younger ages that would be the sort of training ground. And the ADL definitely has a clear policy, which is that we do not endorse or approve of referees at any level other than the AUDL. And teams are prohibited from using referees in any kind of clinic or any kind of hosted event. So if the current status quo remains, then it really kind of couldn't be lost due to refs as you grow up playing Ultimate, because we certainly wouldn't be creating a system that would actually implement refs at any other level. But yeah, I think that those moments are pretty powerful. And frankly, I think that there's a lot of opportunity, whether it's media organizations, really such as UltraWorld, or if there's, social media handlers for different organizations to discuss those questions more. I know that it certainly comes up on Reddit or Twitter, but I think it would be an interesting aspect of, as the sport grows, for people to sort of talk more about, those kinds of moments that, obviously also happen in other systems as well.
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting having the integrity rule aspect of the AUDL, but I think you look at the World Cup, and we're all watching that, and just that's what happens when you have referees. Ultimately, is people start doing that sort of nonsense. It is what happens in a sport when you have referees, because it's It has happened. That's what soccer does. So you can't say it doesn't
Josh
happen.
is shaking his head.
No,
in some sports, that's what happens when you have referees. That's undeniable because we just saw it happen. Right?
No, I don't think that's the conclusion.
You don't think in the World Cup that people have
No, what I'm trying to say.
injury?
No. Oh, no, they definitely do.
Yeah, my statement is, when you have referees, what can happen in a sport is that people will fake things to get penalties from referees.
So what I think, to me, Ruben, is it isn't about the referees. To me, it's about the existence of incentives. The difference between winning the World Cup and coming in second place in the World Cup was, I think, $12 million for your federation. So if you have a $12 million incentive for winning a game, to me, it seems that regardless of if it's USAU observers, WFDF game advisors, or AUDL referees, that you're going to have people who are going to be strongly motivated by that to try to work within whichever system, because I think all three systems have strengths and all three have weaknesses. And so I guess I'm pushing back at the idea that what I saw in World Cup, when I loved watching so many games, that I'm pushing back at the idea that that's caused by referees as opposed to caused by an incentive system.
Sure, but it exists. It exists in a refereed system. And it's not just at the World Cup level, it's lots of levels of soccer. It's a cultural thing within that sport that happens. And we also see within other refereed sports where it's fine to deliberately cheat to prevent a score because it's to the benefit of your team. We see that in NFL all the time. And I remember, if I go back to, I think it was probably early 2000s, some weird MLU thing with Northwest versus some green team versus some gray team up there in Seattle. And I remember Ben Wiggins tackling someone who was about to huck it. Yeah. And that was like, that was because he's a smart guy, right? And he knew that was the right thing to do.
Ruben, of course I've seen that in club games, obviously.
Yeah, I'm not, but that ethos is nowhere able to exist within, like, the sport doesn't work in a self-officiated sport if that's the way you're going to play. The sport can still function in a refereed system if that is the culture you want to create. You can create the culture without that, but you couldn't have that within Ultimate because the sport would cease to function.
So
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, the difference though is too, even though if it happens in Ultimate, you're not relying on just the people in stripes seeing it. So if you can do something without somebody in stripes seeing it, it's okay. Whereas in a self-officiated system, you do something to somebody, you're doing it to the ref. So your opponent is the ref. And so they're going to call it. So it's harder to get away with it. It's not impossible, but it's harder.
Yeah, you just have to pick different ways, like ghost pick calls, for example, or poor travel calls, for example.
Yeah. I mean, it's written in the rules, though, that that is considered outright cheating.
It's written. We have a similar rule.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the first rule in our rule book.
It's interesting because there are strengths and weaknesses of all three. I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, it irks me to no end to watch a player in a WFDF game with high stakes make a terrible call and keep and not back down from the call, even sometimes when there's video evidence that they got it wrong. Now, I will say having video boards has made this better. Players tend to they'll look over and see on the replay, was it a foul? Was it not? And a lot of times they do make the right call. That's been a benefit, but man, does it drive me crazy when I watch a terrible call go unpunished. It drives me insane when observers don't make a call in a situation where they were looking right at the play and they have a great view of it and they don't make a call. It drives me crazy. In the AUDL, refs get it wrong all the time. They blow marking calls constantly because you can't see. I'm criticizing all three of you just so everybody's aware. There are these problems exist across the sport, depending on however it's set up. So how do we get to a system that is sort of optimized? Is there one? Can we optimize within each of these systems to solve some of these issues? From my vantage point, referees have a huge benefit of keeping the game moving. There's less ticky-tack calls. There's less little pick calls. There's less stuff that stops the game. which can be very tedious in club and WFDF games, in USAU and WFDF games. Meanwhile, referees also miss calls in a way that players typically don't. Maybe they make a bad call, but a lot of times that gets resolved by observers. And in the GA system, there is, I think, just a different ethos to the game. And things have been better since we've instituted GAs. When it was just kind of free-for-all and there were no GAs, I mean, there were some games that I watched that were just heinous games, like embarrassing for everybody involved. So how do we get to a system that solves these problems that each of these things have? Can you optimize within them? Because, spectating is frustrating sometimes when you're watching USAU and WFDF games. And that feels like a real weakness right now. Go ahead, Rueben.
I think the technology part of it is a real key thing that you raised. And also, I think you meant fewer tic-tac calls, not less ticky-tac calls. But
Thank you. I appreciate the correction.
Yeah, so the technology, I think, is a real scope to actually enhance self-officiating, I think. And we're continuing to expand on that. And I think being able to work with you to have game advisors mic'd up so that when we can get in there close enough for you, we can actually hear the conversation. Actually, in fact, that really helps the spectator experience as well as part of that. But I'd be keen to kind of experiment more with the video replay, the technology around that, to kind of give the players the power to be able to see that in a better way. I am mindful, though, that I think sometimes the benefits of replay on contentious calls is, I think, greater than it might actually be. I remember one particular call at Worlds where both players had a really strong view about a call. They both watched the replay and they both said, "See, I'm right." They both said the same thing based on the same replay. So I think there is scope, though, for especially some of those egregious calls. If you can show someone, that can make a difference. But, as I said before, our limit is ensuring that it stays self-officiated. If we were going to cross that, I think the observer system is a really good kind of compromise around that and does have some really positive benefits. But I think for us as WFDF to kind of push the limits of where we want to be, technology is one of those useful ways. But we also we're in our infancy as an actual program. We need to actually ensure that we continue to build up the skills of our Game Advisor program to understand the best ways to do that. Part of it is also, though, I think that there's still misunderstanding from the player base because they jump from the USA system to the WFD system. They watch Refereed Ultimate. If they don't understand what it is our role is, what our priorities are, there's a mismatch there. So we need to try and make sure we're all on the same page or on the field about what it is we're trying to do, what fair looks like, and that I think will lead to some better outcomes in the self-officiating framework. But like I said before, I think we're in a good space. I think we've still got room to develop, but they're some of the ways that I would think that we could continue to develop.
I was going to say, I think there's not one perfect system. Each organization has their own priorities. And USAU, we're trying to balance fair, safe, watchable ultimate while still keeping the game in the player's hands. And so that is the goal of the Observer program, which is different in some respects than the other two. But we share a lot of the same things, but I think each organization is going to place the goals and have different goals. And so the programs are going to obviously be different.
Yeah, I think Janna is getting at something that Charlie was kind of pointing to earlier when you talked about the marketability of those integrity call moments. And Josh, you can probably speak to this, but the AUDL's rule system is probably accounting for creating like Josh mentioned, efficient. And part of that is really creating a product that is watchable, that meets the expectations of a fan base, of that additional stakeholder of fans. That I don't necessarily think that the USA Ultimate and WFDF rule sets and officiating systems were built for originally, and maybe have made some moves towards that. I actually want to ask about that, because Janna, you mentioned this, is how has trying to create that watchability, how has that impacted how games are officiated and how the rules are designed? And do you see that further impacting how this will be executed now that you're kind of have this fan base that you want to be able to reach and access in some way?
I mean, it certainly affects both officiating and rule development, because you want the rules. I mean, you saw it in 2020 where we tried to have a like 85 seconds instead of 90 seconds between points. And then, we wanted it to be lower, but had a lot of pushback. So have less downtime is a way, that's something to think about on the rules. We worked with WIFDF on how can we make repulls less frequent. How can, all of these things, not stopping play for travels unless it's thrown. So rule development certainly keeps an eye towards keeping the game moving. Officiating also, it's a balance, because at least both in WIFDF and USAU, these are the players' calls. And if they can, adjudicate that without a third party quickly, that's the gold standard. So if they're like, oh, yep, that was a foul, that's the gold standard. Let's move on. And I think that's the difference. We see that as the gold standard of it staying in the player's hands and we don't have to get involved. Officiating is trying to balance keeping it in their hands, yet not making it drag out. So like if you see that they're not going to actually come to an agreement, then step in. If it looks like it might be fruitful, give them a little leeway. And so, but recognizing that can be really bad for the
Unless
audience.
you're wearing a microphone, in which case
it's interesting.
Get in there.
But yeah, so it's different. But yeah, it's certainly watchability and like movability, playability affects both officiating rules and the rules of the sport.
And watchability is a key reason why the Game Advisor system was introduced. That's why when you go to any WFDF event, all the streamed fields have Game Advisors on them. Like that's a priority when we're trying to allocate Game Advisors, is all the games that are being filmed, all the games where there's spectators there, they should have Game Advisors, because we see it as a benefit to spectators to be able to make sure the game is moving along smoothly, to be able to echo the calls, to just make sure that the game is looking good. I guess that's one of the other roles of Game Advisors, is the players care about the game itself, and Game Advisors care about the game as a whole, as a larger thing. And so we are definitely there to assist with that watchability to the limits that we can within the scope of our system.
What do we need to do about dangerous plays? Been a problem for a long time. I mean, going way back, to be honest, but I wrote an article about this like 5 or 6 years ago, and I don't know that we've necessarily moved that far beyond some of the issues we were having then. Each of the systems has different mechanisms for dealing with it, but what do we do to turn the tide, or perhaps penalize more harshly dangerous plays?
Straight eject players.
How often does that happen right now in the ADL?
Not frequently, but we definitely eject players.
I think there's some education that is not going to solve. It's not going to solve the problem, but it could help with some of it. Teaching players how not to approach like directly at somebody's back. That's going to be dangerous. Not diving at people's knees. How not to go for something. But I don't know. I struggle with this a lot, actually. And we're about to start meeting. Rueben and I talk about it a lot. And I'm about to start meeting with the rules working group, because we're coming up with the 2024 rules, and see if we need to, make it more clear what's acceptable and not for a dangerous play.
And I think within the WFDF system, it's actually less, because of the way the Game Advisor system works, it's less of a responsibility on the Game Advisors to address dangerous play. There's a few other mechanisms we've got to try and deal with that. One is just the rules themselves and making them as clear as possible about what that looks like. We've also recently kind of made sure there's scope for teams themselves to address their own dangerous play and advice about how they should do that they should be accountable themselves about dangerous players on their team and consider removing their own players. That's what we'd much rather see, is your teammate does something bad and your team leadership says, well, that's no good, you're off the field. And then above the game advisor system, we do have the tournament rules group. And that is a body that can make ejections and do all those sorts of things as well. But that's at a very, very high level and basically never happens. But raising awareness of that structure exists is also a useful thing that we could be doing more of. But it's actually not really in the hands of the game advisors necessarily, because they're not going to be the ones who are ejecting people. They don't have that power within our system.
I want to ask Janna, I mean, I know this has not really been sort of publicly discussed, but it is clearly a policy now that observers give a yellow card for dangerous plays, even if they may not themselves assess it as a dangerous play. If players call a dangerous play and the other team says, yes, that was a dangerous play, that's an automatic yellow card right now. Has that system, which was implemented not so long ago, had any impact, do you think, on the game so far?
It's hard to know. We definitely have more yellow cards. And I think it's probably that the system wasn't as consistent as it was before. So instead of thinking card, now we think yellow card. And was it a blue or was it a red? But I don't know if it's affected play. I don't know. I still see dangerous plays. I think I see fewer, but that's certainly, I mean, that might just be confirmation bias on my part. But I'm still seeing the dangerous plays. I would like to figure out if there's a way, Rueben mentioned it, for the teams to handle it. But in talking to players, admittedly USAU players, when something that I saw as a clear dangerous play, where there weren't observers on the game, I talked to the captain afterwards, and they didn't see it as that. And so trying to figure out, a way to do this in a self-officiated manner is going to be tough.
And I wonder what the baseline dangerous play prevalence would be in our sport if we reached our ideal. I mean, there's no way realistically to eliminate all dangerous plays from any sport ever. And then we play a sport with a ball that really flies, it really hangs. And then we attack that with our upper bodies, not like soccer where you're leading with your lower body. It's their center of mass. I mean, it's like like the header battles in soccer. And the header battles in soccer can be quite brutal and people can get hurt. And so there's a certain level where I wonder what we could get it down to. And I agree with what Janna was saying that, if there are different players and different groups of players that have different perspectives on what constitute dangerous play, and that can be challenging too.
So we need to just legislate jumping out of the game. Like it would just
problem solved.
Undoubtedly be safer if you weren't allowed to jump, right? Like
either up or sideways. Ultimate.
Yeah, no up, no sideways. Everybody ground pound.
You have to have a foot on the ground at all times.
Yeah, no poaching.
Awesome. I can start playing again.
Maybe we need this like kind of bumper level ultimate for people. Keep everybody safe and still can play and have fun. But I think that this kind of gets to one of the challenges that you have when you're trying to I think the AUDL and officials have a bit of a different situation because they really have to they obviously educating the players is valuable, but educating the officials will achieve a lot of the goals, while in the other systems, the GA and observer systems, you really have to educate the players in order to achieve your outcome that you want. And you have a much larger player base by which to try and educate. So what are we seeing any movement from these organizations in trying to create easily accessible materials? I know Rueben mentioned the video boards. I know Rueben has actually done some rules videos that are awesome. It's great that those are out there. But are we going to see continuing education? And Josh, you can chime in if the AUDL has any public resources that you think are going to help in this endeavor. But is anybody working on anything that might help clarify some of these rules and provide stuff that will help curb these dangerous plays that we're seeing, or really any of the key popular rules violations?
We definitely have had education to officials via video clips and discussions, whether they were sometimes informal, other times direct. And we're currently working on improving our training videos. They aren't public facing, but there are some that exist, and there are more that are going to exist soon. We're working on them.
And as you know, I'm always keen to try and get out content there to help people raise awareness of the rules. And I think one of the tricky things, I guess, with some of those actual dangerous play examples is that you don't want to kind of necessarily drag those out to be kind of a shaming of the people involved. And one of the resources that we have got that I haven't really tapped into fully yet was that I went into a park with 4 other people and we just kind of fouled each other for the whole afternoon. And I have video footage of all of that. And I'm at one point in time trying to go back and bring that all together to kind of demonstrate and show what that looks like. But the more resources we can get out, the better. But we're also, lots of times we're all just kind of volunteers in this stuff too, that we don't have had all the time and money in the world to do that. I'd put together lots of different stuff, but don't quite have the scope to do that. And the reality is too is that the rules do change and update. And if we're going to make mature, we want to make sure that it's enduring. So it's kind of balancing all those different things. But you're right. The more we can raise awareness of what is the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do, I think the better outcomes that we'll get. And we have a tougher job because we've got to try and do that across continents, across nations, across different languages. And that's always one of the challenges that we have with an international sport. But that's what we're trying to deal with.
Yeah, and we had a video project started over COVID, and it has stalled. But we were looking mostly around like Rules 101 type of things, just as for video rules. But for the like dangerous plays, we do training within the observers. So we have special observer trainings, but we don't have anything public yet. Sort of with Rueben, we don't want to shame players or specific divisions or things. So I think we need to make sure that we do that.
We're happy to shame people, so feel free to press it along. We're not afraid to tell somebody, hey, that was a bad play, and you're a bad person for doing it. No, I'm just kidding.
No, I think the key is, I think if this was a few years ago where people didn't call dangerous play nearly as much, there would be a much greater stigma attached. And I think the good news is that it's. You're not calling somebody a bad person when you call dangerous play on them now.
All right. So maybe a quick rules question, and we're going to wrap up here pretty soon. I mean, we could go on and on on these topics for a long time. There's a lot of rules experimentation happening right now in controlled environments where there's actual games happening. One of the challenges for, I think, USAU and WFDF is that it's hard to really think about rule changes because you can't test them very well. You have to just make them and then hope that they work. But the semi-pro leagues are making real significant rule changes, whether that be time between points, substitutions. We could go through all of them. The AUDL is obviously doing that to a further degree, but I would say that the PUL and the WL are kind of in between the AUDL and USAU in terms of the rules and the way that observers interact with the players and the rules in those games. What can we take from those rule changes that we've seen? Are there things we should be bringing to WFDF and USAU? Because, I mean, obviously this is a slightly separate question from officiating, but there's a lot of this rule stuff happening, and it feels like we haven't seen a lot of major progress in rule changes through USAU and WIFDIF for a long time. My perspective on that.
I can tell you, we definitely look at the semi-pro leagues to see how rules have been implemented and see how they work. They don't always translate to a self-officiated scene, but I'm actively looking at a lot of the rules in AUDL, WL, PUL to consider. We used to do more experimentation back in like the late 2000s, before there were regular seasons for things, and teams were much more amenable to having these tournaments in the spring or summer where you played under slightly different rule sets to try out rules. But when these games start counting, teams don't want to do that as much. And so a lot of our things, like we pick up stuff from WIFDIF, we pick up stuff from ADL. But yeah, we have identified that experimentation needs to come back in the front burner for us.
In a couple of ways, the game has obviously changed under USAU in not that long of a time. Is both and I know it's been a while for the contact call, but the contact call was definitely a change in the flow of the game. And now the receiver travel call is a change in the flow of the game when it's actually implemented the right way. And I think those are, so Charlie, you're saying you're not saying a lot of changes. I don't think you're seeing enormous changes like the introduction of the 3-point line in basketball, but or the forward pass in football. But I think even at USAU, you are seeing those two in particular are changes to flow that were real changes.
Yeah, and look, I think at the smaller scale, Janna and I have obviously been doing a lot of work over the last couple of years to try and bring USAU and WFDF rules together as much as possible. Wherever possible, we're trying to align those rules. But one of the things I do see from the semi-pro sports is that I do envy is the ability to not have those restarts of play cause more stoppages. So obviously when we have a foul or a violation called and everyone has to stop and then everyone repositions and then you go to check it in and people move, that's the stuff that is really frustrating and annoying. And I see great benefits in when you do have the referees and officials to make that happen more smoothly. But as Janna said, I struggle to try and work out how to make that happen, but that's the spirit of what I'd like to be able to see come across. It's just trying to unpack exactly what that could look like when we don't have third-party officials.
Yeah, I mean, I totally understand what you're saying. And to me, the fact is that, again, there's no perfect system to any of these, and there are ways for bad actors to abuse any kind of structure. But I do think that not stopping and allowing people just free movement throughout the solving the issue at hand is works out really well overall. Not only do you not have the restart issues, but of course, when you're cutting, you care about your position, but also like your current acceleration vector. So is your change as well. So when you freeze, to me, and I play Ultimate all the time, and I don't play in the AUDL, so I play under USAU rules. When you freeze, it's never the same thing. If the goal is to act as if the violation didn't occur, well, you're not really doing that. Something's really fundamentally changed. And so I have found, to me, that just saying, all right, everyone, you can just keep moving wherever you want, works out actually usually better.
The obvious counterpoint is that like people will do, take fouls like they do in basketball or hack somebody on a huck to stop a breakaway situation. I mean, I think the solution there is you just yellow card that kind of stuff. Because I agree. I think allowing more free flowing motion is great for players and fans, and like doing the herky jerky, everybody go back to where you were it's very clunky.
It is. It's not as bad as it used to be. Players have trained themselves, but yeah, it's still pretty clunky.
I've always compared it to asking people to strike things from the record in the courtroom. Like, you can't pretend you didn't hear that. In the same way, like we can't really quite get back to where we were and like get the exact action that was happening when the violation occurred. It's just you get as close as you can, I guess.
That's a great way to say it.
I have a specific question for Rueben. This actually comes from somebody who was playing, I believe, at WCC, and they asked about GAs. And there are sometimes issues with GAs being able to give perspective on a play because they're along the sidelines. Are there thoughts to allowing GAs be on the field of play so that they can position a little bit better to maybe make a not a ruling, but give a perspective on a play because they were in a better position to see it than, being on the sideline?
Yeah, that's an often raised conversation, and especially with the observers who are part of the game advisor system. But it's not currently something that we are considering doing, and primarily it's because of where we see that on our priority list. It is not our most important thing to get the right perspective on every single play. It's more just a benefit that because we have impartial people on the sideline, you might as well be able to ask them if you can, if they're there. And we see that it's not just the fact that the game is self-officiated that's important. It's that it actually looks self-officiated and that it feels self-officiated. Those are also really important parts of it. And when you start having third-party officials on the field during play, that doesn't look like it's self-officiated anymore. So it kind of defeats the purpose of what we're trying to do. So our goal is to have a game that is self-officiated, that feels self-officiated, that looks self-officiated. That's the whole reason we're keeping this system like that, is because self-officiating is so important. If that wasn't as important, then yes, we would go to the observer system where they're on the field. But because of our principle about what we value within that, that's why we do it that way.
All right, maybe we should leave with this. What makes a good blank observer, ref, game advisor, and then how can people get involved?
I think caring about the game and caring about being a good official and practicing is what makes a good official. And what was the second blank?
How can people get involved as an observer?
Yeah, I think if you contact your either regional coordinators or you just email Mitch at National Observer Director, we're pretty good about when people request. Like I'm a trainer. A lot of us are trainers. When people request to have clinics, we just have them. So I've certainly done several clinics in Seattle.
Rueben?
Yeah, so what makes a good game advisor? I think it's a couple of different things. I think you have to know the rules. Like it's a really important part of knowing the rules. You have to care about the rules as well. Like you have to think that the rules are important, and you have to also value the spirit of the game. You have to value that sense of self-officiating. But one of the things I'd say, the first thing I say to most of our trainees when we've got an event or our game advisors at the start of an event is you have to realize that you're not that important, that it is the player's game. So that's one of the biggest skills, is knowing that, yes, it's great that you're there, but you're actually not that important because it's not your game, it's the player's game. And so actually having that awareness of that is a really important skill to have, an important mindset to have. We've got a whole bunch of events coming up next year under WFDF, and we're currently looking for game advisors for those. And if people are interested, they can get in touch with me. And if there's interest in training, we can also try and organize training different places around the globe. We don't have as many trainers, but we try and get as much out there as we can to increase the number of game advisors.
All right, Josh.
I think we require the same fundamental skills. You have to have knowledge of the rules. You have to have good positioning. You have to have clear mechanics. You have to have for officials, for referees, some game management skills and confidence. And please email officials.outreach@theaudl.com or straight to me at josh.cooper@theaudl.com. And we'll see if we can work you in and get you some training.
One last little thing on all of these, you don't have to have those skills now. You might have an inner official waiting to come out. And you might put on a different persona when you're officiating. And so even if you think you don't have that now, you can learn it. It can be a learned skill.
Well, I'm going to become an official as soon as I can. I'll do all three. I don't know if that's legit while I'm running a media organization, but as soon as I'm capable and I'm allowed to do it, I'm in.
We're ready for you, Charlie.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and have a wonderful holiday season.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice seeing you all.
Josh Cooper, Janna Hamaker, Rueben Berg with us here on Deep Look. For Keith Rayner, I'm Charlie Eisenhood saying so long, and we'll talk to you next week.